February 14th, 1943. On that day, 12 American Marine pilots took off from Guadalcanal in the most powerful single-engine fighter the United States had ever built. 2 hours later, 2 of their Corsairs had been shot down, 6 other American aircraft torn apart, and 10 American airmen would never see another sunrise. The 400 Emmer's wonder weapon the Marine Corps had promised would dominate the Pacific had just suffered the worst defeat any American fighter would take on its first day of combat. That fighter was the F4U Corsair. The press never reported the losses. The after-action report was classified. The public wouldn't learn the truth for nearly 2 years. What happened in the 11 months that followed, how a beaten aircraft became the deadliest fighter of the Pacific War, is one of the great untold stories of World War II. To understand it, we start with the man on the other side of that February morning, a half-blind Japanese veteran named Saburo Sakai, who finally sat down, 12 years later, to write the truth. The best pilots in the world. In 1941, the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy were the finest naval aviators the world had ever produced, and they flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, so agile and deadly that Allied pilots were ordered never to turn fight it. At Pearl Harbor, 9 Zeros were lost, while American aircraft burned by the hundreds. Over the Philippines, Zero pilots claimed 550 Allied aircraft in the first week alone. Over Ceylon, Japanese accounts describe British planes spiraling into the Indian Ocean for the loss of only a handful of Zeros. Kill ratios of 10 to 1, even 15 to 1 were common, and intoxicating. A 23-year-old warrant officer named Hiroyoshi Nishizawa wrote to his younger brother that February, calling the Zero a perfect weapon that harmonized with the pilot's spirit like a samurai's sword, and dismissing American planes as flying trucks without soul. He wasn't lying. He had no reason to yet. In Nagoya, the Zero's designer, Jiro Horikoshi, 39 and exhausted, knew exactly what his masterpiece could not survive. To make it turn faster than any Western fighter, he'd stripped it bare. No armor for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, thin aluminum that cracked where an American wing would flex. He'd built a fighter that danced. He'd also built one that burned. I designed a fighter for a nation that lacked resources, he said years later. It was an elegant solution to poverty. In 1943, that poverty hadn't caught up with Japan yet. It was coming. In 1940, Chance Vaught's XF4U-1 prototype, built around a monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, producing nearly 2,000 horsepower, became the first American single-engine fighter to top 400 miles per hour. The Navy had asked for 260. There was one problem. It couldn't land on a carrier. The long nose blocked the pilot's view on approach. The landing gear bounced violently on impact, and the stall behavior at low speed was sudden and unforgiving. The 1942 carrier qualification trials were a disaster. Corsairs porpoising down the flight deck, snapping arrestor cables, crashing into the barriers. In a decision that would later seem almost comical, the Navy rejected its own fastest fighter, the very aircraft built for carrier duty, and handed it to the Marines instead. VMF 124, under Major William E. Giss, had 8 weeks to learn the aircraft before deploying. On February 12, 1943, 22 Corsairs landed at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Bent wings, huge cowling, a strange whistling shriek from the wing root intakes in a dive. Japanese pilots would soon name it Whistling Death. 2 days later, 12 of those Corsairs flew bomber escort over New Georgia alongside P-38s and P-40s. They climbed into more than 50 Zeros rising from Kahili Airfield. They'd been told the Corsair could outfly the Zero in any condition. They'd been lied to. In under 20 minutes, the Americans lost 8 aircraft, including both bombers they were escorting, for 3 Zeros. It became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The report was buried for months. Major G's walked alone to his tent afterward and didn't speak for an hour. He'd be dead in 3 months, shot down over the Russell Islands, never seeing what his aircraft would become. What no one realized yet, the loss wasn't the story, it was the lesson. At Rabaul, Japanese officers reviewed inflated kill claims and high morale. But buried in one report was a petty officer's warning. An unfamiliar American fighter with bent wings had outdived him, its controls holding firm above 350 miles per hour, where his zeros froze. He wrote that they'd been told things about American aircraft that were no longer true. The report was read twice, then set aside. Sakai later wrote that the Imperial Navy in early 1943 was an institution that had stopped listening, even as message after message came back from the Solomons, saying the same thing. The admirals believed spirit and training would always close any technology gap. They were about to learn that spirit cannot outclimb a Pratt & Whitney R2800. At Henderson Field, First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, 26, a former mechanic who'd earned his wings the slow way, studied the February losses and drew the obvious, unspoken conclusion. The Corsair could never outturn a zero at low speed. It didn't need to. It could outdive and outclimb anything in the sky, and its 650 caliber guns could fire for nearly 30 seconds straight. Climb high, dive fast, fire once. Don't turn, don't slow, don't look back. Use the dive's energy to climb again and repeat. It became known as boom and zoom, a tactic born from humiliation that would change the Pacific. Walsh got his first kill April 1st, 2 more on May 13th, the same day Major Geese was shot down for good. By August, flying outnumbered and alone near Vella La Vella, sometimes with his own engine failing, Walsh had earned what would become the Medal of Honor and the title of First Corsair Ace. That same April, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto launched Operation Igo, over 200 aircraft thrown at Allied positions across the South Pacific. It cost Japan dozens of irreplaceable pilots for gains the Allies could absorb. Days later, American code breakers, having read his itinerary, sent 18 P-38s over 400 miles to intercept Yamamoto's inspection flight over Bougainville. They shot it down. The architect of Pearl Harbor was dead, and in Tokyo, officers were beginning to understand something had fundamentally changed. In September 1943, a 30-year-old Marine major arrived at Espiritu Santo to take command of a newly formed fighter squadron. His name was Gregory Boyington, and his men would call him Pappy because he was a decade older than most of them. The press would later call him a hero. The truth was messier. Born in Idaho in 1912, he'd drunk hard since his teens, failed at marriage and fatherhood, washed out of a peacetime Marine assignment over debt and conduct, and then flown P-40s for the Flying Tigers in China, until he brawled his way out of that job too, borrowed money from the Chinese government he never repaid, and came home in disgrace. At one low point in Seattle, broke and broken, he sat in a hotel room with a service pistol on the table and considered ending his own life. He didn't. The Marine Corps recommissioned him in late 1942 anyway. It was short on pilots and couldn't afford to be choosy, and in August 1943, handed him a squadron of leftover replacement pilots nobody else wanted. He named them the Black Sheep. Within days of their first patrol, they were scoring kills. The Pappy Boyington of legend, hero of the post-war newsreels and the TV series decades later, was, in truth, a 30-year-old recovering alcoholic, given one last chance by a Corps too desperate to be picky. Alongside the Black Sheep flew the Navy's VF-17, the Jolly Rogers, under the disciplined Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn. Together, they fought over Rabaul, the largest Japanese air complex in the Pacific, 5 airfields deep, once the launch point of Japan's conquest, now the place it sent its remaining pilots to die. Inside Rabaul, Ace Tetsuzo Iwamoto kept a secret journal. By late 1943, he was writing sentences no Japanese officer would have written a year earlier. The Zero could no longer fight the American plane on equal terms. A Japanese pilot could only catch a Corsair if the Corsair let itself be caught. The war in the air, he wrote, was no longer being won by pilots. It was being won by engineers. After the war, U.S. Navy intelligence reviewing gun camera footage found that 20 to 30% of Zero kills claimed by Corsair pilots had actually been Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars, a nearly identical-looking Japanese Army fighter. The Corsair's legendary 11-to-1 kill ratio over the Zero, repeated in almost every popular history since, was, technically, an exaggeration. The Corsair still won, the Zero still lost. But the margin was narrower than the post-war press ever admitted, and the men who actually flew the missions never needed the inflated legend to know what they'd done. The real secret: the Corsair beat a Zero that had already been crippled by something invisible. Japan, running out of pilots. Its pre-war training pipeline, brutally selective, produced only around 100 elite aviators a year. Midway alone cost over 100 of them in an afternoon. By 1944, replacement Japanese pilots were reaching combat with as little as 60 hours flight time. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy was commissioning over 2,000 new aviators a month, each with 600-plus hours of training. The Corsair didn't really defeat the Zero. The American training system defeated the Japanese one. The engine just finished the job. If you're enjoying this, subscribe to WWII Dark Legacy now. Lindbergh's about to show up, and it's not the story you learned in school. In 1944, Charles Lindbergh, 42, still disgraced from his pre-war isolationist stance and stripped of his Army commission, arrived in the Pacific as a civilian consultant for Pratt & Whitney's manufacturer. Unofficially, with the quiet blessing of sympathetic commanders, he flew roughly 50 combat sorties in P-38s and Corsairs. On July 28, 1944, he shot down a Japanese reconnaissance plane, a kill history could never officially credit to a civilian. More important than the kill, he taught Corsair pilots how to lean their fuel mixtures and set their props for maximum range, nearly doubling the aircraft's reach beyond what the manuals claimed. He'd handed the Marines a strategic weapon. There was no longer anywhere in the South Pacific safe from a Corsair. By September 1944, Rabaul was a graveyard, its aircraft withdrawn, its harbor full of half-sunk hulls. The Black Sheep were done. Boyington had vanished over St. George's Channel in January, presumed dead. The Jolly Rogers had rotated home. Nishizawa had 38 days left to live. Rabaul fell, not because it was overrun, but because Japan no longer had the pilots to defend it. The machine had failed. The men hadn't. The math had simply run out. On January 3, 1944, Boyington dove on a Zero over St. George's Channel, radioed what he believed was his 26th kill, a record that would have made him the Pacific's top American ace, and vanished into a cloud. For 20 months he was listed missing, presumed dead. FDR approved his Medal of Honor for a man everyone assumed was already gone. He wasn't dead. He was a prisoner at Omori Camp, Tokyo Bay, deliberately hidden from the Red Cross for the entire 20 months. The turkey shoot, and the ace who never saw it coming. In June 1944, over 400 Japanese carrier aircraft, flown by pilots with barely 100 hours training, were shredded by Hellcats near the Marianas in what Americans called the turkey shoot. Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force effectively ceased to exist that afternoon. That October, a slow, unarmed Japanese transport plane was shot down over the Philippines by Hellcats on a routine pass. Aboard it was Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, 24 years old, credited with 87 victories, Japan's greatest ace of the war. He didn't die in a dogfight. He died as a passenger, killed by a pilot who never knew what he'd hit. There was no glory in it. There was only war. The day before Nishizawa's death, 23-year-old Lieutenant Yukio Seki took off from Luzon with a 250-kilogram bomb under his Zero and no intention of landing. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had concluded that conventional combat could no longer inflict meaningful damage on the American fleet, so he proposed something no navy had ever ordered before: crash the planes themselves into the ships. The word was kamikaze, the divine wind. Seki had been married for 4 months. The night before he flew, he told a reporter, quietly, that Japan's future was bleak if it had come to ordering its best pilots to die, that he wasn't flying for the emperor, wasn't flying for the empire, was only flying because he'd been ordered to. The next morning, off the coast of Samar, he crashed into the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The bomb detonated below deck, the fuel tanks went up, and the ship sank in under half an hour, taking more than 100 American sailors down with her. The Kamikaze Campaign that followed lasted 10 more months and killed over 3,000 Japanese pilots, every one of them flying an aircraft the Corsair had already beaten in every technical sense that mattered. Bravery couldn't outfly a Pratt & Whitney R2800. There was no bravery left in the world that could. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. That night, Vice Admiral Onishi wrote letters to his wife and to the families of the 4,000 kamikaze pilots he'd sent to die, apologized, and took his own life by seppuku, deliberately refusing medical aid, dying over 15 hours later. 12 days after that, Marines liberated Omori Camp and found Gregory Boyington alive, 112 pounds, sick, asking quietly if the war was really over. That October, Truman hung around his neck a Medal of Honor struck 18 months earlier for a man presumed dead. Boyington lived until 1988. He never stopped drinking. He never became the legend the TV series made him. He was just a man, and that had been enough. Saburo Sakai, half-blind, spent the rest of his life telling Japanese audiences that war was the worst thing humanity ever invented. He died in 2000, at 84. Tetsuzo Iwamoto died in 1955 from an old wartime injury, having flown over 200 sorties and been shot down only once. Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero's designer, lived until 1982, calling his creation an elegant solution to poverty, never proud, never regretful, just a man who'd built what he was asked to build. The Corsair stayed in production until 1953, flying its last combat missions in a forgotten 1969 war between Honduras and El Salvador. Over 12,500 built in all. The Zero, just over 10,400 built, ended production in 1945. But the deeper truth is this: the Corsair never really beat the Zero on its own. The Corsair was the visible weapon of an invisible victory, one that belonged to American shipyards launching 15 new carriers in 1943 alone, to Pratt & Whitney engineers mass-producing 2,000 horsepower engines on assembly lines, to flight instructors training tens of thousands of aviators a year. It belonged to a democratic industrial system that could outbuild, out-train, and out-replace any totalitarian empire in history. The Zero was beautiful. The Corsair was better. But what the Corsair really represented was a nation's ability to outproduce and outlearn its enemy, and that lesson outlived the war. Within 30 years, the country that built the Zero was building Toyotas, applying the same philosophy of efficient, mass-produced engineering that had once cost it the skies. The Corsair didn't just shoot down the Zero. It shot down an idea. That spirit could substitute for industry. That elegance could defeat abundance. Abundance won. It's still winning. The Corsair pilots never forgot they'd been the lucky ones. Better aircraft, longer training, a country that won. The men they killed had been just as brave, just as devoted. flying for a flag with no industrial base strong enough to keep them alive. Decades later, at reunions and memorials in Hawaii and Tokyo, veterans from both sides would shake hands quietly and say little. They'd learned the same hard lesson from opposite sides of it. The lesson: the nation that builds best, teaches best, and produces best, wins. In war and in peace, the rule doesn't change. It's still in the textbooks, in the wreckage at the bottom of the Solomon Sea, in the Medal of Honor that hung around a 32-year-old Marine's neck in October 1945. The world has only kept on proving it. If this is the kind of history you want more of, classified reports, uncomfortable numbers, the men the legends left out, subscribe to WWII Dark Legacy. New stories drop regularly, and this channel only exists because people like you stick around for them. See you in the next one. WWII Dark Legacy.